And here we are. Where we left off, I was talking about sexual selection, and that's evolution caused not by individuals with certain traits passing their genes on preferentially because they are better adapted for the environment, but it's caused by differential reproductive success. It can be caused by members of one sex competing among themselves for breeding rights to members of the other sex. Often that's males competing for females, but there's a lot of exceptions to that, by the way. It's not always nearly that stereotyped. There are plenty of species where the females fight over access to choice males, and then in hermaphroditic species, it can get downright weird. The other form of it is intersexual selection, where members of one sex choose members of the other sex to mate with based on traits that they've got. And we were talking about intrasexual selection, and I gave you the example of sea lions attacking each other for access to females, because in northern, not sea lions, elephant seals, dominant males control a harem of dozens of females. 90% of the males don't get to mate at all. And when two males fight each other for control of a harem of females, it's frequently to the death. And yeah, given that each male weighs over 1,000 pounds and they just bash into each other with their teeth, it can be a rather spectacular death. So we left off there. There's other forms of competition between members of one sex that don't necessarily involve combat. One of them is mate guarding. These are a couple of octopi, actually technically is octopodes. You can just say those squishy things with 8 arms, Abdipus aculeatus. When they mate, the male will stay with the female for days at a time, mate with her repeatedly and frequently. And let me see, I believe this is the, that's actually the male at the lower, that's the male at the lower left. And he is inserting a specialized sperm transferring arm that he's got called a hectocotylus. In cephalopods, that's squid and octopus and cuttlefish and things like that, the male doesn't have a specialized sperm transfer organ. What he uses is one of his arms, and the arm is often modified to pick up sperm packets and transfer them to the female. So he'll kind of reach inside himself, pull out a sperm packet, and use that specialized arm to insert it into the female's body cavity. And this is what he's doing here. He's keeping that specialized sperm transfer arm in her body cavity. She's up at the upper right. And as long as he's doing that, he's physically blocking any other male from trying to mate with her. So that's called mate guarding behavior. And it's another form of male-male competition. He's competing with other males. He's just not necessarily fighting other males. It gets weirder. There's a surprising number of marine fish and octopus and crustaceans and even some freshwater fish, like bluegills, do this. You might say they have 2 sexes but 3 genders because they have 2 different types of male. Some males are large and they're mate guarders. They will pair up with a female and defend the female against an intruder. And then there are some males that are small, and in some species they actually look like females, and the small sneaker males will slip past the guarders and mate with females. Sometimes the sneaker males look like females, and so they don't trigger a response from a garter male. Other times they're just very fast at what they do. There's a couple of cuttlefish mating. Cuttlefish are kin to squid and octopus, and that's a female over there on the left, and she is getting mated with on the right by a sneaker male who's a lot smaller than she is and is able to get past the guard of any garter male that might be defending her. And I think I mentioned, if you want a non-ocean example of this, bluegills do this too, where there are males that will build a nest and attract females to it and mate with them and stand guard over them. And there's other males that are very small, look like females, and try to slip in and add their sperm to the mix while the garter male isn't looking. There's concern about, men using these laws favoring, the rights of transgender individuals as an excuse to dress up as women and sneak into women's bathrooms and mate with them at moments where they're vulnerable. Humans don't actually do that, but bluegills do. I kind of think it's funny that the governor of North Carolina accidentally outlawed bluegills. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. You can even find 3 different types of males in an isopod. Those are crustaceans. The isopod that you'd know would be the roly-poly. That's actually a group of crustaceans that has adopted an existence on land, but there's a lot more of them in the oceans. Paracerchaeus sculpta lives inside sponges, and they've recently been found to have 3 different types of male. On the right is an alpha male. He's big, he's got spines. He stakes out a breeding territory and defends it. In the middle, that beta male looks like a female, so he can sneak past an alpha because he doesn't trigger a defensive response, and he can sneak in and mate with the female. And then that's a gamma male over on the far left. That's basically a sperm bomber. He will just swim in as fast as he can, jink past the alpha, and drop some sperm and then beat it before the alpha can get there. So you've actually got 3 different strategies. This is not ocean related, but there's actually something similar going on in a Western species of lizard. This is really neat. You have one form of male lizard that guards a harem, one form of male lizard that mates with only one female, and one form of lizard that tries to sneak copulations with females. And it turns out that each one can beat the other one and is beaten by a third one. The garter male who guards a bunch of females, he can't defend against the sneaker. The sneaker can't sneak a mating with the single female type because he's too good at his job. But the single female type can get his female taken away by the garter with the harem. So basically, each strategy beats one and is defeated by the other, which means that nature has basically evolved rock, paper, scissors. And neither of those 3 strategies ever becomes totally dominant. I don't know if the work has been done, but I would suspect that these isopods might have a similar thing going on, that each one of these strategies beats the second strategy and is defeated by the third, and that way neither one is ever permanently favored for very long. That would be really interesting to look at. Okay. Chuck D came up with the theory of sexual selection and was pretty sure that males were always the competitive ones. That males always did the chest bumping and puffing and strutting and flashing their bright colors. And the females were always the choosy ones. Here's Darwin suggesting the weapons of offense and the means of defense are possessed by males for fighting with and driving away their rivals. Males are the ones with courage and pugnacity, ornaments of many kinds, organs for producing vocal or instrumental music. Think bird calls or frog calls or things like that. Their glands for emitting odors, most of these structures serving only to allure or excite the female. It turns out there's a lot of exceptions to this rule. This tends to match with what people in Darwin's time thought men and women ought to do, that the woman's supposed to be coy and choosy and not make the first move, heavens no, and the men are supposed to be vying with each other for the favors of the female. But it turns out nature doesn't work that way. I'm not going to give any advice on how people should behave in their romantic lives, but just to give one example from the ocean, these are pipefish. They are closely related to seahorses. The difference is the body isn't bent in that seahorse type shape. The jaws are basically fused into what amounts to a very small soda straw. So these can only eat very small food. And it turns out that in seahorses and in pipefish, the rules are reversed. Male pipefish are choosy, and females compete with each other for access to particularly tasty males. The reason seems to be this. Whichever sex invests more energy in reproduction has more to lose. Whichever sex invests more energy has fewer opportunities to reproduce. If you have to produce eggs, well, eggs by definition are bigger. Eggs very often contain yolk, which requires metabolic energy to make. Some species nourish their young from their bodies before birth, like mammals and incidentally like scorpions. Bet you didn't know that scorpions have placentas and nourish their embryos in mommy's body. Some animals feed their offspring after they're born, like mammals with their milk, great white sharks with their uterine milk. So one sex usually has to invest more energy. It may be more time, it may be more physical activity, it's certainly more metabolic energy, more ATP burned. And so whichever sex invests more energy in each attempt to reproduce will have fewer opportunities to reproduce. A female songbird has to make an egg in her ovary and put lots of yolk into it and put a shell around it. A female songbird may have to invest a drop of fluid in about 2 minutes of his time. Right, so there's an asymmetry in reproductive investment. And the idea is that selection favors behavior patterns by the sex that has more to lose, that select high quality mates. The mate that invests more is the one that needs to be more careful, because the mate that invests more cannot afford to make like Alexander Hamilton and be throwing away his shot, or possibly her shot. So in the sex that invests more, selection will favor behavior patterns that select only high quality mates. On the other hand, the sex that invests less energy in reproduction can increase its fitness as often as possible. And we call this asymmetry of sex. Often, the male invests less in reproduction than the female because, by definition, the female makes bigger gametes. The female gametes may have lots of yolk in them. Sperm are a heck of a lot cheaper and much faster to make in bulk. And as I've mentioned, in many species, the female may do all of the parental investment and the parental care, and the male may contribute nothing but sperm. This is true in northern elephant seals, who are some of the worst dads in the animal kingdom. A leading cause of death for elephant seal pups is getting crushed by a male who just wasn't looking where he was going. And the females do all of the care in that species. So that difference is called asymmetry of sex. And the reason pipefish and seahorses reverse that rule is that in pipefish, the male takes care of the eggs. He will keep them either in a pouch in the case of seahorses, or in the case of this pipefish, he sticks the eggs to a patch of highly specialized skin. You can see a big cluster of eggs on his belly, and he doesn't just carry them, he provides them with oxygen. That pouch, or that skin, is able to secrete oxygen and nourish the eggs directly. And it takes a good deal of energy for him to be able to do this. I've actually seen seahorses giving birth, and it's seemingly an exhausting process for the male. The males have extra weight to carry around. The males may have to swim harder if they're not as streamlined. So in this particular species, the male invests more. So the females compete with each other for access to the best males, the males with the best looking pouch, I suppose. And the males can be choosy about who they want to mate with. In fact, I hate to ruin another fish species for you, but it was found pretty recently that if a male pipefish accepts eggs from a female and then finds a better looking female that he'd rather take eggs from, he can cut off the oxygen of the eggs that he's got and make like Taylor Swift and shake them off and choose that other female to mate with. So he can actually get rid of his batch of kids if he finds the possibility of making a batch that he prefers. So yeah, kind of grim there, but so it goes. Okay, so there are lots of other examples I can think of among birds and insects and things like that, but there's an example for you in the ocean. The males compete, females choosy rule is sometimes called Bateman's rule, worked out by a guy who studied fruit flies, which is one where the male does invest less than the female. But even in fruit flies, it's not always that simple. And certainly when you look at the full spectrum of the living world, you can find so many exceptions to Bateman's rule that it probably isn't that much good as a rule. You can even find exceptions to the rule that the sex with more to invest is the choosy one. We cover this more in my evolution class, but you shouldn't take these rules as anything more than rules of thumb, and lots of exceptions are allowed. But this is a case of Bateman's rule reversal that seems to be explained pretty well. Okay, why should particular traits be selected by sexual selection? What's so great about a female songbird picking the male with the brightest colors? What's so great about a female stickleback fish picking the male with the brightest belly and the wiggliest headstanding courtship dance? You know, what's so great about female blue-footed boobies, and that is their name, seabirds picking the male that can pick up and show the brightest, babyest blue feet? What's so great about blue feet? This is a short version of a pretty long topic, but there's several possibilities, and sometimes more than one is the case. These are not necessarily exclusive. In some cases, what mates prefer is traits that directly benefit themselves or their offspring. Some mates will prefer to find mates that have traits that mean that they're directly getting a benefit, or their offspring's getting a benefit. That's the direct benefits hypothesis. In the indirect benefits hypothesis, mates may prefer traits that aren't directly beneficial, but that mean the offspring will be able to reproduce more on average. There are cases where individuals are kind of predisposed to prefer males or mates with a certain trait. It's something about the way that their nervous systems are wired. That's the pre-existing sensory bias hypothesis. And then mating specificity, individuals prefer traits that clearly advertise what species they belong to. Remember, if you mate with an individual that is not of your own species, you're not going to make offspring most of the time. Or you might produce offspring, but they might not be very fit. In many cases, selection will favor individuals that can clearly say, hey, I'm this species, I'm species X. All you ladies in species X line up over here. All you ladies in species Y go somewhere else. So I found some examples of these, and this is a really cool example of direct benefit. In 1995, on sandy seabeds off Japan, people started finding this. These very regular geometric figures 2 meters in diameter. Now, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's actually pufferfish. Aliens don't have anything to do with this. I don't think they have anything to do with anything, but let's not go there. It turns out they are the nest of a pufferfish called Torquegener albomaculosus. I assume you have heard of pufferfish because they're the ones that are able to gulp water or air and inflate their bodies very rapidly as a defense mechanism. They can inflate too large to get swallowed by a predator. Some of them have scales that stick out and make spines as well. It depends on the species. And it turns out that Torquegener albomaculosus, this pupfish, the males dig those nests out with their fins. And each male pufferfish is 12 centimeters. That's roughly 6 inches. And these nests are 2 meters across. So a 6-inch fish has to dig out a 78-inch nest, and that takes a while. In fact, it takes them 7 to 9 days to build each nest. So once the male has built that nest, the female will pick the nest, lay her eggs in it, and round goes the great circle of life. So this is a case where the female may be making eggs, but the male is certainly investing a great deal in reproducing because he has to dig this gorgeous nest. Why do females select certain nests? It turns out that those nests, if you look one more time, there's fine sand right there in the center. You can see the center is very fine. The surrounding material is much more coarse. And what it is thought that this nest does is it can take currents from any direction. That's why it's round. It can pick up current from any direction and channel it towards the center. So that nest is able to direct oxygenated water towards the center, which is where the eggs are. So if you're a female and you pick a badly built nest, you're less likely to leave offspring. You'll mate, you'll lay your eggs, but the offspring may not get all of the oxygen that they need. If you're a female and you prefer a very good nest, you're likelier to leave more offspring because those offspring directly gain a benefit. If you pick a good nest, your offspring will probably get more oxygen and they'll develop better, they'll develop faster, they'll be more likely to survive. So that would be a case of direct benefit. Females pick, not because females are smart enough to think of this over, But females that have genes that influence them to pick good nests will leave more babies, which will have those genes. While pufferfish that have genes that influence them to pick bad nests won't leave as many offspring that can carry those genes on. So even though the pufferfish are probably not thinking this through, females that have one type of preference will tend to have more babies than females that don't. So that's sexual selection by direct benefit. This is an example of indirect benefit, and I actually had a hard time finding a proper marine example of this. This is a stickleback fish up at the top right. Sticklebacks, genus Gasterosteus, include marine species and also include freshwater species. And I think this work was done on freshwater species. The male's got a red belly, and the male will build a nest on the floor of the body of water where they live, and then will try to attract the female by doing what they call the head standing dance. Basically standing on his head and wiggling that belly at any female that comes by. Yeah, this is the stickleback equivalent of the guy who paints himself in school colors and goes to frat parties and goes, woo, a lot. And it turns out that females prefer red males. The redder, the better. Those females just lose it for a bright red belly. And the redness is inversely correlated with susceptibility to parasite infection. The redder the father is, the fewer the offspring of his that are likely to get infected by tapeworms. That's what the data set is showing right there. That offspring of a male that isn't very red might have 75 to 100% tapeworm infection. Offspring of a very bright male may not get infected by tapeworms at all. There's a pretty strong inverse correlation there. So if you're a female and your genes make you like red males, and you pick the reddest male that you can to have your babies, you will have more offspring that survive because fewer of them will be attacked by parasites. If you're a female that doesn't care about red, you are likely to have fewer offspring that survive because more of them will be vulnerable to parasites. And in fact, we get this in other species. This is red grouse from Scotland. And that male right there has the most gorgeous bright red eyebrows. And females really, really like males with bright red eyebrows. And it turns out that the redness of the eyebrows is related to the incidence of roundworm infestation. The fewer the parasites, the brighter the eyebrows. So the idea is that bright red and bright yellow pigments are linked with low parasite levels because bright red and bright yellow pigments are markers of healthy immune systems. All right? The redder you are, the healthier you are, and your offspring can inherit some of that healthiness, some of that parasite resistance. So this would be a case of selection by indirect benefit. All right, you don't get, if you're a female stickleback, you don't get anything personally out of mating with a bright red male, but you are likelier to have offspring that are resistant to parasite infection, likelier themselves to grow up and be healthy and have babies of their own. You would think this would work really well in the ocean, especially on coral reefs, where you certainly have a lot of brilliantly colored fish in the shallows. And I had a very hard time finding support for this being true. I did find several studies that suggest that in typical marine fish, bright colors are not related to health or to parasite resistance. So I'm not sure why these fish are so brightly colored, but it may not actually be sexual selection, or at least it's not sexual selection for indirect benefits. Something else may be going on in the oceans. Now, they did find a case. This were researchers in Norway looking at a Norwegian species, the broad-nosed pipefish, and they were able to find males will choose females in part on the number of black spots that they have. In fact, the researchers that were studying pipefish were able to manipulate this variable by injecting small amounts of black dye under the skin of female pipefish, so they could manipulate the number of black spots. Why does this matter? There are a number of parasites. In fact, those of you in parasitology, we're going to see these pretty soon, that form a stage inside the skin of a fish. That stage is called a metacercaria, if you must know. And what fish will often do is deposit melanin, black pigment, in the skin around the parasite. So if you are a female pipefish with lots of black spots, you are a female that is probably infested with lots of parasites. And males usually chose females that didn't have black spots, and that would be indirect fitness. If you're a male and you pick a very spotty female, you're mating with a female that's not very healthy. You're mating with a female that doesn't have a very strong immune system, and your offspring are likely not to have a strong immune system either. So if you're a male that strongly prefers non-spotted females, you're going to choose healthy females. Babies are going to be healthy, and your genes are likelier to get passed on. It's not always that simple, though. It turns out that not all populations of this species show this, so there's probably something else going on that's a bit more complicated. Exactly what, I'm not sure. I'm not a pipefishologist. You can even find sexual selection happening on the gamete level, and this gets into what I call mate recognition systems, that sexual selection takes place in some species because individuals have traits that clearly mark what species they belong to. Now, in mussels like this, you might not think that sexual selection can happen because these guys are broadcast spawners. They pretty much just fire off eggs and sperm into the water and hope for the best. And certainly the adults don't really have courtship behavior because, well, they're clams and they just sit there. You know, they can't exactly do courtship dances or anything like that because they're permanently glued to the rocks that they live on. But it turns out that mussel sperm prefer certain individuals' eggs over others. And it turns out that the eggs that they prefer are the ones that are the most genetically compatible. Over there on the x-axis, you've got a measurements of egg preference. If you give sperm 2 different eggs to swim to, which one are they going to pick? The ones that the sperm prefer most strongly are also the ones that give you the greatest larval survival. Sperm are deliberately picking eggs that are, how do I want to put this? Sperm are able to sense and swim towards eggs that are more likely to be genetically compatible and produce larvae that are likeliest to survive. So there you've got sexual selection going on. It's going on the chemical level. The sperm are responding to some kind of chemical cue. Now that's kind of weird. I'm not entirely sure how they're doing that, but sexual selection can act at the gamete level as well. There's been a claim that a marine snail called Fusatriton which mates with internal fertilization, actually makes two different types of sperm, one type that fertilizes the eggs and one type that attacks the sperm of other males, which is really kind of neat to think of all these sperm having a little, dog fighting in the middle of the female, with some of the sperm from each male trying to kill the sperm of the others. I'm not sure that's been confirmed, though, but that would be really neat. And you can sometimes see sexual selection at the sperm level, even when you can't really see it happening just by looking at the adults. I couldn't make this stuff up. If it all seems confusing, sometimes it can be that way for sharks. This was observed a couple of years ago. Leonie is a female leopard shark from the Reef HQ Aquarium in Queensland, Australia. And she in the past had mated with the male and given birth to several litters. But in 2012, they moved her to a tank with no males. And it surprised the hell out of everybody when Leonie gave birth to 3 live pups after 3 years without any contact with a male at all. This is because several species of sharks and rays, and if memory serves, at least a couple of snakes can do this too, can at least sometimes switch to a mode of reproduction called parthenogenesis. There's a couple of different ways it can happen, but basically this just means producing fertile eggs with no partner. So several species can switch over to parthenogenesis in the absence of a male. Leonie is the first shark that's known to have produced offspring both ways, through reproducing sexually with a male and reproducing asexually. And that's one of the offspring, a seemingly healthy baby shark. Doot, 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 doot. Yes, I just did that. Okay, we've seen it in several species of sharks and at least one species of ray. I can't remember what that species, that may just be called the spotted ray. I'd have to look it up. So it does happen. The problem is that it seems to be kind of a desperation response in many species. That sharks and rays will reproduce sexually if at all possible, and only when you have these long periods of isolation do they switch over to parthenogenesis. You might wonder why it's not more common, because parthenogenesis means you can have babies anytime. You don't have to wait around for finding a mate. You don't have to do anything to attract a mate. If you want babies, you can just make them yourself. Which raises the whole question of what's so beneficial about sex. Why is it that sexual reproduction is so favored? And one of the reasons why it's beneficial is that, well, it's for the same reason that if you take a picture and you photocopy it, and then you copy the photocopy, and then you copy the copy of the copy, and then copy the copy of the copy of the copy, after not sure it's a complete mess and you can't tell what it was. The reason is every time you photocopy something, you add error. You add little areas and things like that. And then every time you copy a copy, you copy the errors of the previous generations and you add a new set of errors. So the amount of error in your photocopies will always go up. It will almost never go down. The same thing goes on in organisms. If you have a lineage of organisms that reproduce asexually, and every generation there is a chance of a mutation, change in nucleic acid sequence. Many of those mutations add for you. So every generation, you increase the number of mutations, and you don't have an easy way to get rid of them. That phenomenon is called Mueller's ratchet. Mueller was actually Russian biologist of the early 20th century. Mueller was the guy who discovered that X-rays cause mutations, by the way. And a ratchet is a wheel with spikes on it that makes it turn only in a single direction. A socket wrench is an example of a ratchet. And a ratchet is a wheel that only turns one way. And the tendency of asexual lineages to pick up mutations and never get rid of them is metaphorically another wheel that turns in only one direction. And the great thing about sex is that it breaks Mueller's ratchet. If a male has bad mutation number 1 and female has bad mutation number 2, if they mate and have offspring, there is at least a chance that some of their offspring will not carry either. Others, of course, might carry both, right? But, think about it this way. If I'm a carrier for, I don't know, cystic fibrosis, and my wife is a carrier for hemophilia, there's at least a good chance that my son is not going to be a carrier of either. So that's one of the great advantages of sex, is that sexual reproduction is basically genetic engineering, and it enables you to create offspring that don't share the negative mutations that you've got. You can repair DNA over the generations. Sex also generates variation, right? Asexually produced offspring are generally all the same, right? They're clones or close enough. Individuals that don't vary are all equally susceptible. Say we've got a population of asexuals that are all identical, and let's say a new parasite comes in. If that parasite can invade the body of one, it can invade the body of all of them. On the other hand, if we have a population that varies a lot, then even if a parasite can infect one, it may not be able to infect all of the others. Blended is kind of like passwords. If you all had laptops and they all had identical password, they all had the password ABC123 or something, and nobody ever changed them, then any hacker that broke into one could break into them all. On the other hand, if you all had different passwords and you all changed them once every 30 days, then even if a hacker cracked one of them, he's not going to have any advantage at getting into the others. So as long as your passwords vary and change, you're a lot safer from hackers. It's the same thing with the threats that organisms face with competitors, parasites, predators, and pathogens. If you're in a shifting environment where conditions are always changing, your best bet is not to get stuck on any one particular lifestyle, but to vary. And the way you generate variation is by sexual reproduction. You're basically taking your DNA and somebody else's DNA and genetically engineering them together. Sex is basically genetic engineering. This, by the way, is called the Red Queen hypothesis. You probably heard of Alice in Wonderland. Well, the author, Lewis Carroll, wrote a sequel called Through the Looking Glass. And Alice's Adventures in Wonderland involves cards, if you remember. Through the Looking Glass takes place in a dream world that's happening on a chessboard. And here is Alice, and she's being dragged along by the Red Queen because the sides are red and white instead of black and white for whatever reason. And they're running as fast as they can. And when they stop running, Alice notices that the scenery hasn't changed. And she says to the Red Queen, where I'm from, when I run, I usually get somewhere. And the Red Queen says, that's stupid. Here, it takes all the running you can do to stay in one place. And that's what's going on with sexual reproduction. If your environment is constantly changing and they're constantly evolving predators, pathogens, and parasites, you have to be variable in order to adapt. And it takes all the adapting to do just to hold the ecological niche that you've got. So that's why this is called the Red Queen hypothesis. You constantly have to adapt just to be able to hold your niche space against all of the competitors, predators, et cetera, that would love to take it away from you. Okay, so that is that's the point of sexual reproduction. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.